They called it the last green for a reason that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with memory. On the world of Mirath, landscapes were catalogued and sold like colors: cobalt seas, obsidian deserts, chrome forests. Only scattered fragments retained the old, irrational husemerald moss. The iridescent sheen of beetle backs, the flame light of certain kinds of fungi that sang when rain fell. The last green was one of those fragments, a pocket of wildness tucked beneath an enormous cap of a mushroom the size of a barn, where spores drifted like drifting snow and the air tasted faintly of iron and citrus at the edge of that shaded circle, where a ring of twisted roots knuckled from the earth like the knuckles of some sleeping giant. Sat a woman whose presence looked as if it had been carved from a myth and then fitted with modern seams. Her ears tapered to graceful points. White hair braided with thin copper wire fell down her back. Her eyes burned with an amber light that was not quite human bio-implanted iris lenses or some ancestral trait. No one could say for certain, and her skin bore inked sigils whose geometric precision suggested both ritual and algorithm. The straps of her armor were bronze and etched with script that hummed softly when the wind touched it. Her clothing was yellow, not the bright primary yellow of advertisement, but a softened, living yellow that echoed with pollen and sun. She called herself Lirael, though she tolerated titles more than she trusted them. Lirael had come to the last green for reasons that were personal, political, and possibly prophetic. A summons in a hand-worn letter from a mechanic named Juve, an echo of the old voyages on the back of her mind. In a dream that had woken her 3 nights running, an image of a frog holding a spear beneath a mushroom as tall as a city. Dreams were notoriously bad evidence in Mirath. So were letters left in the wrong hands. Nevertheless, she had come. He arrived as if the scene had grown him overnight. A frog the size of a dog in scaled breastplate. Not oversized in a comical sense, everything on Mirath refused to be conventional, but rather perfectly proportioned to a life lived hopping between marsh and moss, a life that had been through iron and fire. He stood on hind legs like a small soldier, a spear taller than his shoulder in one hand, a rounded shield in the other. His skin was the mottled chartreuse of a river stone. The plates of his armor were beaten copper decorated with spirals and runes. There was something uncanny about the way he held himself, at once animal and disciplined, as if a gladiator's training had been grafted onto reptilian instinct. Their eyes met. Not with the flash fiction of first impressions, but with the slow eyeing of 2 beings measuring consequence. Lirael had expected to be wary. What she had not expected was the warmth of recognition that loosened something in her chest. As if a chord she had forgotten how to play twanged back to life. "You're smaller than the stories," she said, allowing a smile that tasted of wary relief. The frog called Grok. Later, though at first he offered only a quick, courteous nod, wrung the spear against the ground and let his gaze slide past Lirael, out toward the ring of roots in the darkness beneath the mushroom cap. "Stories inflate or shrink with perspective," he croaked, voice rough like gravel and sweet like pond water. "I am what remains in boots, in brine, in duty," a laugh escaped Lirael. It surprised her with its genuine edge. Then she sat back, eased her weight on a folded leg, and looked at him properly, like a captain studying the map of a stranger. "You're a warrior," she said. "Not merchant or trickster." Grok's throat pulsed. "I sell neither, and I trade with neither. I was of the order of pawn knives once. We guarded the crossing of the Merit rills before the bridges the city builders made. The order is a memory now. I keep the spear because it remembers how to point." Lirael's fingers toyed with the rim of a small metal amuletan heirloom, perhaps, worn smooth from being turned and worried over. "I am Lirael of the Guildwood Aries," she said. "I came because a human mechanic left a message scratched on the flank of a rusted automaton. Find Grok. He knows the door." Grok's bulging eyes narrowed. "Juve." He said the name as one might say, old brass, both affection and iron. He kept that automaton like children keep dolls. He taught it to sing the old lullaby. Door is a big word. Which one does he mean? Lirael watched a spore drift between them like a pale, lazy star. The forest's smell earth, rot, the faint tang of forgotten copper made her head swim. She thought about doors, not the wooden slabs of human habitat. Not the forced portals cranked in merchant docks, but doors of old wire and living stone. Doors that opened because someone had the right song and the right name and the right grief to push the seam. In the underside of myths, those doors were less dramatic and more functional, ways through a mountain, fungus that led to another world, a conduit in subterranean water that spat travelers into other climates. Juve's note had been hurried, the letters half-scratched and riddled with grease and humor. The human mechanic had never used humor lightly. "Which door?" Lirael asked, and then shook her head. "Never mind. Tell me about the order." "It sounds like a poem." Grok blinked slowly. "A poem with knives." He sat more comfortably and propped his spear against his shoulder. The shield pulled warm shadow across his webbed toes. "We were volunteers. Children of marsh keepers and drift sailors. We swore to keep the rills clear of predators and of smugglers. We had a code carved into our shield's guard until the last light. The last light came when the city barges took to skimming the marsh with their hulls bright and flat. The bridges that followed stranded the rills. The order was paid in scraps and made of memory. I kept the spear because my clan said the weapon must always be carried by a living hand. You kept it better than the city kept the bridges," Lirael said. Grok shrugged, a slow ripple in the muscles along his shoulders. "Cities forget everything they build. They have banks for their forgettings." He paused, then as if considering whether to share a private map. "But some doors are not built by memory or city. They require two hearts to open. One that remembers the old pathways, and one that remembers why the paths exist. Juve scratched the message because he believed you might be that heart that remembers the why." Lirael's lips parted. She had not thought of herself as a key. She had thought of herself as a thief one who had stolen a ship from a broker to watch the horizon. One who had traded the blades for songs. To be told you were needed as a hinge for an ancient gate was a useful measure of hubris or fate, depending on which way the wind blew. She felt the hairs on her arms twitch under the sunlight. "Where is this door?" she asked. Grok adjusted his shield. "Under the cap," he said. He gestured with the claw careful. The movement was almost delicate to the mushroom looming over them. Its bellowing surface was blotched with colors like old quilts, and under its underside, a labyrinthine tangle of roots and bioluminescent veins pulsed faintly. "Not many dare crawl beneath the cap. The spores will mind you. They will show you every memory you think you have and then rearrange the truth in the morning. But there is a hollow, a hall where the roots meet like ribs. There, in the root heart, lives the door." Lirael's hand went to one of the inked sigils on her collarbone. The pattern warmed, as if in agreement. She rose, graceful and quick, the motion practiced. There it was again, the idea of a song. "Do you have the song?" she asked. A frog soldier holding a spear is an odd image to most philosophers, but for Lirael it made practical sense. Grok nodded, then fished inside his armor and took out. Not a codex or a scroll, but a small cylinder of stone, old as the bones of the rill. When he opened it, a faint, raw sound fluttered out like wind through reeds, like metal tuning itself. The sound dissolved into a rhythm that felt older than the language they breathed. Grok hummed it low and steady, and Lirael felt. The sigils on her skin stir like moths. They walk together beneath the mushroom's shadow, spurs drifting, light cut to a soft green. The path narrowed until their shoulders grazed roots that pulsed with inner light. The bioluminescent veins threw long, soft shadows across their faces. Sounds came from unseen places. The creak of old wood, the wet patter of distant water, soft buzz of spores colliding like 1,000 tiny bells. Sometimes the spores seemed to whisper names of people Lirael had known and people she hadn't. Each name carried a story and a weight. At one point, Lirael stopped. She closed her eyes and felt more than saw the tapestry of time stretching around them. In the dark between the roots, a current ran, faint but persistent. It was the path of those who had traveled the world not by map but by song. Couples and caravans. Lovers and smugglers, mute priests carrying talismans of rain. The current hummed with memory, and for a moment, Lirael understood why Grok's order had carried spears. Memory had to be defended. They found the door in a place neither elegant nor convenient. A fissure the size of a doorway, rimmed with knotted mycelium, and beneath it, a pool of still black water. On the other side of the fissure, the roots continued, darker, like the underside of a whale. The door itself was not a slab, but a sema. Thin line between root and fungus that glowed with a blue that was not in any common catalog. There were markings upon it, like the ones etched on Lirael's skin, concentric diamonds that suggested coordinates as well as prayers. "It will ask for a reason," Grok said, his tone a croak of both reverence and warning. "All doors ask. Some will accept coin. Some ask for blood. This one asks for a story." Lirael laughed softly. "A story? I have many. Which will it like?" Grok's eyes shone. "The door likes the honest ones. It will sniff out the frills." They sat by the seam and told it the story the door demanded. Lirael spoke first, and her story was not loud, but it was true, of an empty nest in the high Aries. Of the day her mother folded up a map and gave it to her because they had no other use for it. Of the broker who sold their barns and left them a recipe for salt. Of the nights she slept under stolen stars. She spoke of the song she had learned as a child, a lullaby that suggested leaving rather than staying. Grok spoke next, and his voice was musical in a different key, of the rills he had guarded. Of the children he had taught to hold spears. Of the day the barges came and flattened their crossing. Of his vow to keep a blade until the last light. He told the door about the creature he had failed to save, once a young tadpole that had been taken by a net, and how that failure had haunted him like a tooth. The door listened. The seam fluttered like a heart. The spores gathered near their shoulders as if they were curious children. Then, when their stories had been finished, no more, no less, the seam widened. It did not open with the theatrical flaring of portals in the children's tales. It opened the way a book opens, a single slow hinge revealing a corridor carved by water and laced with old metalwork. The air smelled of rain that had not fallen and of distant siren. They passed through, and the world reoriented. The mushroom, immense and benign above, sealed like a great lid. Light receded into a thin silver vein that threaded along the corridor. The walls were lined with small niches, and in each niche was a token. A child's toy made of driftwood. A coin stamped with forgotten gods, a lens filed to clarity. Each token hummed faintly when they passed. "You brought one," Grok observed. Lirael touched the amulet at her throat. "It is not much." Grok nodded toward the niches. "Maybe it will be sufficient." The corridor ended in a chamber that smelt of salt and old circuits. In the center of the chamber stood a machine like a sculpture and a shrine at once, canted plates, possibly delicate gears, and a central node of blue light that pulsed like a heart. Around it were cables like vines, and at its base lay something wrapped in oilcloth. Lirael's hand trembled when she peeled the cloth away. It was the automaton Juve had loved, a small, childlike thing with brass joints and a face that had been smoothed by the passing of hands. Its surface was not cold, but slightly warm. And the lullaby it had been taught etched into a tiny cylinder of sound in its chest, faintly echoed from its ribcage. The automaton's eyes were dark as wells. When Lirael brushed dust from its cheek, a faint chime sounded. The machine stirred. "Juve comes here sometimes to feed it," Grok said. "He places the coin of the climb in its palm." He indicated a small rusted coin engraved with the symbol of the city. "It remembers voices. It remembers the road." Lirael set her amulet against the automaton's palm and watched the node thrum. The machine's eyes flicked open like small suns. For a moment, the chamber was full of the little lullaby stitched into metal, and the sound felt like a key turning in a lock. Then the central node brightened, and the chamber exploded, not with violence, but with revelation. For a breathless instant, the walls of reality thinned, and the corridor showed its true face. A seam between worlds where water ran in the wrong direction, and grasses sang like flutes. The door had not simply connected to pockets of Mirath. It had opened a loop between times. Through it flowed memories and potential paths people had left like long, neglected roads. Lirael felt a tug at her heart, the possibility of changing what had already been. She could, perhaps, plant a message in a past that would make bridges unbuilt, or a river undammed. She could save the tadpole Grok had failed. The temptation was sweet and heavy. Grok read the pull in her face and tightened his grip on his spear. "We cannot unmake what is necessary," he said. "The door gives choices, but not absolution. It reveals what is possible and then asks us to be responsible with that knowledge." "What if what is necessary was a mistake?" Lirael whispered. Grok's eyes were ancient suddenly. "Then the mistake is still the path we walked. Our stories build the bridges as well as the gaps. To change one is to change the other." They had come for the door, but they had not come alone. Outside the chamber, in the green, a band of humans had gathered. A small, ragged convoy led by Juve, the mechanic whose hands were oil-stained and whose laugh had always had a spare key in it. Juve had followed the automaton's humming, and the faint childish tune the machine couldn't forget. He stood at the threshold, with a grin cracked like a soldered seam. Behind him were other straighters, wanderers, a young woman with a story in her eyes and shoes that had traveled 3 provinces to many. "You're back," Juve said, and his voice was both question and gift. Lirael felt something settle in her chest, like a pebble dropped in a pond. The door pulsed. The automaton opened its mouth and sang the lullaby Juve had taught it, the melody surprising them by the way it fit into their present like a missing piece of a clock. They did not make impossible choices. They made choices that mattered. Grok gave his spear to the automaton for a moment, an odd, formal transfer of trust, and the automaton held it like a child clutches a toy. Juve worked his hands over the machine and soldered a tiny new wire into its chest. Lirael threaded her amulet into the automaton's grip and whispered into the node a truth. She had been carrying like a stone. She did not desire to change the past to erase pain. She wanted to use the door to remember well enough to make better roads forward. The door accepted that. It was not a benign deity offering miracles. It was a mirror, patient and plain. It showed them not what was idealized, but what could be roads that took labor and foolishness and sacrifice. It whispered of bridges built with hands rather than banks, of barges that might learn to skim without smashing breeding pools, of a shallow rerouting of a trade route that could spare a stream. It showed Grok a place where tadpoles could crawl from nursery pools to the rills without nets. It showed Juve a way to design a gear that could filter spore drift to prevent its smothering in nurseries. It showed Lirael a map of alliances made between marsh keepers and city guilds, between swimmers and songkeepers. They did not change the past. They gathered the machine and the plans and the small, costly knowledge the door granted and passed back into the last green. Night had fallen by the time they emerged, and the mushroom cap above them shone with faint Venus light like an aurora flattened bioluminescent flushing through fungus tissue. Juve clapped Grok on the shoulder with the ease of a man relieved. "You ever consider taking a steam runner into the city?" Juve asked, half joke, half invitation. "We have need of someone who knows where the rills sing." Grok contemplated the thought as he might contemplate a new pond. "I might enjoy the smell of coal," he said at last. And everyone laughed because humor settles dust. When they departed, Lirael did not promise to stay. She promised something more hopeful and less clean to return. Often enough that the bridges they planned would not be forgotten. She left one of her sigils carved into the automaton's chassis, so that when Juve walked through the markets, the children would see the mark and ask a question. Questions were seeds on Mirath. A good question could sprout committees or protests or songs. A better one could sprout change. The last green returned to being quiet in the way. A garden returns to being full of its own business after the gardener leaves. Spores settled, and the bioluminescence thinned. Lirael walked away with Grok at her side, and they moved like two halves of a conversation. They were different species. Different ages, different habits of sleep. But they had woven something between them that was not merely practical, a pact of repair. A week later, in a small workshop bolted between two water towers, Juve set a cog into place and let the automaton sing. The lullaby had changed. It now had a small, new verse that mentioned a frog with a spear and a woman with moonlight in her hair. Children stopped on their way to school to listen. An old marshal at the market slowed and remembered the river crossing he had once walked without thinking of the tadpoles. A trader in a bright coat laughed at the impossibility of it and then walked home with plans in his pocket. Small things rearrange large systems when they gather. In time years, a ledger of disagreements, and treaties later, the barges were taught to skim with lighter keels. Nursery pools were fenced with gentle slats. A new guild formed, the Keepers of the Rill, not as warriors but as stewards. Grok trained more hands. He taught them to listen as well as to hold spears. Lirael came and went. She spoke in council rooms and in sunlit clearings. Her voice taught songkeepers to argue with engineers. Juve sold his automaton, a small library of supplements, new scripts for its lullaby. Little gears that made it better at telling the difference between a child's laugh and the wind. Decisions were made, not without pain, not without argument and loss, but they were made with a memory of the Doors Council, honest stories, not revisions. The future that opened was not gloriously new. It was patched with hands, argued into existence by those who'd lost things and wanted not to make others lose the same. Years after their first meeting, on a night when the moss was vivid and the mushroom cap was old and generous, Lirael returned to the last green and found Grok waiting at the root edge with a young frog at his side, small, bright-eyed, and wearing a strip of leather like an apprentice's sash. Lirael crouched. The young frog hopped forward and offered her a small,
oddly shaped shell.
For the song, he croaked. Lirael took the shell and felt in it the quiet of rivers and the laughter of children. She tucked it within her robe, by the amulet she never quite took off. She thought about doors and the delicate business of choosing not to use them like erasers. Will you teach him to guard? She asked Grok. I would teach him to remember why we guard, Grok replied. That is the better lesson. Guarding for guarding's sake breeds edges. Guarding for life makes you gentle with those you protect. Lirael nodded, and for a long while they watched the last green breathe, in the hush beneath the mushroom cap, where spores sighed and the ground kept its secrets. The world felt less like a ledger to be balanced, and more like a story to be tended. The door still glowed faintly in its chamber under the roots, patient as a ledger, but kinder than any bank. It would be there when needed, when a tired hand wanted to look back, when an aching heart needed to know what might have been. It would not be a weapon. It would be a teacher. And if, on some clear morning, a child asked Lirael if the frog with the spear was a hero, she would smile and say, no, he is a keeper. If they asked whether the door had been opened to change the past, she would answer, we do not unmake the sea. We learn to build boats for the currents we have. If they asked whether it had worked, she would tell them about gardens that had stopped being foreign colors and had instead become places where people returned. The story is not tidy. The spores would continue to sing their half-truths, and the city would forget things in favor of profit now and then. People would still make mistakes, but there was at least a new cadence in the way Mirath moved, decisions made with a memory of the river. Bridges built with an ear for tadpoles, songs that contained engineering notes and apologies. And that, more than a legend of sword and triumph, was the gift Lirael and Grok had opened beneath the great mushroom, where the green held tight and the door hummed like a patient. Honest thing, if you ever find a seam in the world that asks for a story, remember to tell it the truth. Doors like to listen to honest reasons. They remember. And what they remember is the kind of power that turns ideas into bridges rather than into erasures.